I didn't raise my voice when I saw his name on the application, but something inside me went very, very quiet. It was a standard rental form, the kind you fill out in 10 minutes and forget about just as fast. 2 pages of typed information sitting open on the kitchen counter like it belonged there, like it hadn't just cracked my entire life down the middle. I wasn't even looking for it. I had walked in from the garage, keys still in my hand, the faint smell of motor oil clinging to my jacket after a long day, and there it was, printed, signed, dated. Olivia's name at the top. Our address crossed out. A new one typed beneath it. And then, just below hers, a second applicant. Daniel Brooks. Her boss. I remember blinking once, slow, like maybe I'd read it wrong. Like maybe my brain just needed a second to catch up to something that didn't make sense. But the letters didn't move. They didn't rearrange themselves into something easier to swallow. Daniel Brooks stayed exactly where he was, black ink on white paper, clean and undeniable. 3 days earlier, my wife had stood in the same kitchen, arms folded, voice calm, and told me she thought we needed space. Separate homes, she said, like she was suggesting we try a new restaurant, like it was practical, reasonable, something adults did when life got complicated. I didn't argue. I didn't slam anything or ask the kind of questions that start fights you can't take back. I just nodded and listened while she explained how it would be temporary, how it might even help us, how sometimes distance gives people clarity. And the whole time, I remember thinking how composed she sounded, how certain, like she had already made peace with the decision I was just now hearing for the first time. Looking back, that was the first thing that should have bothered me. Not the words themselves, but how easily they came out of her. 8 years of marriage doesn't usually unravel in a calm, well-rehearsed speech. It slips. It stumbles. It shows cracks. But Olivia didn't crack. She was steady. Controlled. Almost rehearsed. I told myself I was overthinking it. That work stress had been getting to both of us. That maybe she was right and a little space would reset things before they broke for real. That's what I wanted to believe, because the alternative didn't have a shape yet. It didn't have a name. Not then. Now it did. Daniel Brooks. I set my keys down next to the paper, careful, like any sudden movement might change what I was seeing, and leaned in just a little closer. Same phone number format. Same email structure. No mistake. No coincidence. My wife wasn't just moving out. She wasn't just asking for space. She was planning something else entirely, something that started long before that conversation in the kitchen and didn't include me at all. And the strangest part wasn't the anger. It wasn't even the betrayal, not yet. It was the silence. The kind that settles in your chest when everything finally lines up and you realize you've been the only one in the dark. I didn't touch the paper again. I didn't call her, didn't send a text, didn't ask for an explanation I already knew wouldn't sound like the truth. I just stood there, in my own kitchen, staring at a life I thought I understood, and realized I had been reading the wrong story the entire time. I left the paper exactly where it was and stepped back like distance might change what it said, like a few feet of space could turn it into something ordinary again. But it did not. It just sat there under the kitchen light, quiet and final, and I realized something that felt heavier than anger, heavier than anything I could have reacted with in that moment. I realized she had already moved on in her mind. Long before she asked me to move out of her life. And somehow I had missed it, or maybe I had chosen not to see it, because the truth is there are always signs, small ones at first, things that feel off but easy to explain away if you want to keep the peace, and I had wanted that. I had wanted normal, even when normal was starting to slip through my hands. I leaned against the counter and tried to trace it back, not in big dramatic moments, but in the quiet details that had started to change. The ones that did not demand attention at the time but now felt like they had been pointing somewhere all along. Like the way Olivia had started taking calls in the other room instead of right in front of me, how she would lower her voice just enough that I could not make out words, only tone, light, careful, almost rehearsed, or the way her schedule had shifted, early mornings that did not quite line up with her usual hours, late evenings explained with simple phrases like, "Work ran long, Or team dinner. Things that made sense on the surface, things I did not question because I trusted her, because that is what you are supposed to do when you build a life with someone. I remember one night in particular, about a month ago, we were sitting on the couch, television on but neither of us really watching, and her phone lit up on the coffee table, just a name and a short message preview before the screen went dark again, Daniel, followed by something that made her smile, not a polite smile, not the kind you give out of habit, but something softer, something private, and I noticed it. I remember noticing it, but I told myself it was nothing, that coworker's text. That it did not mean anything, and she picked up the phone just a second too quickly, turned it slightly away, and said it was about a project, and I nodded, because that was easier than asking why her voice sounded different when she said his name. It is strange how the mind works when it is trying to protect you, how it edits reality just enough to keep things stable, how it files away moments that do not fit the story you believe you are living, and only brings them back when the story changes, when the truth forces its way in whether you are ready or not. Standing there in the kitchen, I could feel all those moments lining up, one after another, forming something I could not ignore anymore, something that had been building quietly while I was focused on work, on bills, on the routines that make a life feel secure, and the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that the conversation about separate homes had not been the beginning of anything. It had been the continuation of a plan already in motion, a plan that did not include hesitation or doubt, because Olivia had not looked uncertain that night. She had looked prepared. I pushed myself off the counter and walked to the sink, turning on the faucet just to hear something other than my own thoughts, watching the water run as if it might wash away the clarity that was settling in. But it did not, it only made everything sharper, and for the first time since I saw that name on the page, I felt something shift inside me, not anger, not yet, but a kind of calm that did not belong in a moment like this. The kind that comes when you stop questioning what is happening and start understanding it, because once you understand it, you can decide what comes next, and in that moment, standing in my own kitchen with the sound of running water filling the silence, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever Olivia thought she was planning, whatever version of the future she had already stepped into, she was not the only one capable of making a move. I turned off the faucet and let the silence settle back in, heavier this time, more deliberate, like the house itself was holding its breath with me, and for a second I just stood there staring at my reflection in the dark kitchen window, trying to see if anything had changed on the surface. But it had not. I looked the same face, same posture. Same man who walked in 10 minutes ago thinking his biggest concern was whether he had time to finish a report before Friday, and that was the strange part, how quickly everything can shift without anything visibly breaking, no shouting, no slammed doors, just a quiet realization that the life you thought you were living had already been replaced with something else. I walked back to the counter, and this time I picked up the application, slow, careful, like it was something fragile. Even though it was not, it was just paper, just ink, just information, but the weight of it felt different, like it carried more than numbers and signatures, like it carried intent, and intent is harder to ignore than suspicion, because suspicion can be wrong, but intent is a decision, something chosen, something acted on. I read through it line by line, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see how far it went, how detailed it was, how real this plan had become. Employment information, income verification, references, everything filled out clean and complete, no hesitation in the handwriting, no gaps, no last-minute changes, just two people moving forward in the same direction, organized, aligned, confident. I paused at the date and felt my chest tighten just slightly. It was from 2 days before she had that conversation with me, which meant when she stood in front of me talking about space and clarity, and doing what was best for us, she had already signed something that did not include me at all, and that was the moment it stopped feeling like confusion and started feeling like strategy. I set the paper back down exactly where I found it, smoothing the corner without thinking, like keeping it neat somehow kept me in control, and I exhaled slowly, steady, the way you do when you are trying not to let something show on your face. There was a time, not that long ago, when I would have reacted differently, when I would have picked up my phone right then, called her, asked direct questions, demanded explanations, but that version of me assumed we were still operating on the same page, that we were both being honest, and standing there now, I knew that was not true anymore. Whatever Olivia was doing, she was doing it carefully, quietly, with intention, and if I rushed in without thinking, all I would do is give her the advantage of seeing it coming. I have spent most of my adult life building things, projects, systems, plans that require patience, timing, precision, and one thing you learn quickly in that kind of work is that reacting too early can cost you everything, because once you show your hand, you lose control of the outcome. I walked into the living room and sat down slowly, letting the weight of the situation settle into something more structured, less emotional, more deliberate, and for the first time since I walked in the door, I stopped asking why and started asking how long this had been going on, how much she thought I did not know, how far she was planning to take it, and most importantly, how I was going to respond without making a single move that I could not take back. My phone sat on the table in front of me, dark and silent, and I stared at it for a moment before turning it face down, not because I was avoiding anything, but because I already understood something she did not. This was not a conversation anymore, this was a situation, and situations are not handled with emotion, they are handled with strategy. And if she believed she was the only one making plans, then she had already made her first mistake. I did not move right away, I just sat there long enough for the quiet to settle into something I could use, because once you stop reacting, you start seeing things differently, and the picture that had felt chaotic a few minutes ago was starting to organize itself into something clearer, something that looked less like a sudden betrayal and more like a sequence of decisions made over time, and that mattered, because if it was planned, then it could be understood, and if it could be understood, then it could be countered. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and let my mind walk backward through the last few months, not emotionally, not looking for pain, but looking for structure, patterns, anything that showed intention instead of coincidence, and the more I thought about it, the more it lined up in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Olivia had not just changed, she had adjusted small, precise shifts that would not raise alarms if you were not paying close attention, and I had not been, not because I did not care, but because I trusted the foundation we had built, and trust has a way of blinding you to things that do not fit the version of reality you want to keep. I remembered how she started talking about independence again, not in a direct way, but in passing comments, things like wanting her own space to think, or how people in her office were exploring new living arrangements, phrased casually, like observations instead of suggestions, and at the time I treated them like background noise, ideas that come and go without meaning anything serious, but now they felt different. Like early drafts of a conversation she had already decided to have. There were other details too, the kind that only stand out once you know what to look for, like the way she began dressing slightly more formal even on days when she did not have meetings, or how her tone shifted when she talked about work, more engaged, more invested, like something there mattered more than it used to. And then there was Daniel, always mentioned just enough to feel relevant but never enough to feel suspicious. A name that appeared in conversations with the same steady frequency, consistent, controlled, never over-explained, and that is what makes something believable, not the absence of detail, but the right amount of it. I stood up slowly and walked back into the kitchen, not rushed, not tense, just deliberate, and looked at the application again without picking it up this time, because I did not need to read it anymore. I understood what it represented. It was not just a plan to move, it was a plan to replace, to transition from one life into another without disruption, without conflict, without having to confront anything directly. And that kind of plan only works if the other person stays unaware long enough for it to be completed. I let out a quiet breath and checked the time on the stove. She would be home in less than an hour, which meant whatever I decided to do next had to start now, not with confrontation, not with accusations, but with control, because once she walked through that door, every word, every expression, every reaction would matter. And I could not afford to give her anything that would force her to adjust her strategy before I understood it completely. I walked upstairs, stepped into the bedroom, and looked around at the space we had shared for years. Nothing out of place, nothing obviously wrong, and that was the point. Everything still looked normal on the surface, which meant whatever was happening was being kept beneath it, carefully, intentionally. And I moved to the dresser, opening the top drawer just slightly, not searching, just confirming. Her things were still there, organized, untouched, like she had not begun packing yet, which told me something important. The transition was not complete, it was still in progress, and that meant I was not too late. I closed the drawer gently and stood there for a second longer, letting that realization settle in, because timing changes everything, and right now, I still had it. She thought she was ahead, she thought I was behind, and that imbalance was the only advantage I needed, as long as I did not lose it by acting too soon. I went back downstairs, and this time I did not sit. I moved with purpose, not fast, not frantic, but steady, like each step had already been decided before I took it, because that is what control feels like when you finally take it back. It is not loud, it is not emotional, it is quiet and precise, and it starts with understanding exactly what matters and what does not. The application was still on the counter, exactly where I had left it, and I slid it a few inches to the side, not to hide it, just to see if anything else had been left nearby, anything small, anything overlooked, because people who plan carefully still leave traces, not because they are careless, but because no one can account for everything all the time. There was a folder partially tucked under a stack of mail, plain, nothing labeled on the outside, the kind of thing you would not notice unless you were already looking, and I pulled it out slowly, opening it just enough to see inside without disturbing the contents more than necessary. Printed emails, a few bank statements, and something else that caught my attention immediately, a draft lease agreement, not signed yet, but filled out almost completely, the same address from the application, the same names, and this time I saw something new, a projected move-in date, less than 3 weeks away. I stared at that line longer than I expected to, not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed something I had already started to accept. This was not hypothetical. It was scheduled, measured, already moving forward whether I reacted or not. I closed the folder and placed it back exactly where I found it, aligning the edges so nothing looked out of place, because the last thing I needed was for her to notice anything had been touched before I was ready. I checked the clock again, less than 40 minutes now, and I could already imagine the routine, the sound of her car pulling into the driveway, the door opening, her voice calling out something normal, something that fit the version of our life she was still presenting, and for a moment I let myself picture it clearly, not to get lost in it, but to prepare for it, because the hardest part of this was not going to be what I knew, it was going to be acting like I did not know it. I walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator, not because I was hungry, but because routine matters, small normal actions that do not raise suspicion, and I took out a bottle of water, twisting the cap slowly, giving myself something to do with my hands while my mind stayed focused on what came next. There were 2 paths in front of me, one obvious, one effective, and the obvious one would have been easier: confront her, lay everything out, demand answers, force the truth into the open, but that path ends quickly, and it ends on her terms the moment she realizes what I know. The other path required patience, required restraint, required me to let this play out just long enough to see the full picture, to understand every piece of it before making a single move that could not be undone. I took a slow drink of water and set the bottle down, steady, controlled, and in that moment I made the decision that would shape everything that came after. I was not going to interrupt her plan, not yet. I was going to let it unfold, step by step, exactly the way she intended, because the more she believed I was unaware, the more she would reveal without realizing it, and information is leverage. Far more valuable than any reaction I could have in the heat of the moment. I heard a car pass outside and my attention shifted instantly, not tense, just alert, because now everything mattered: timing, tone, presence, every detail that would either keep me invisible or expose that I was already ahead. And as I stood there in the quiet of the kitchen, waiting for the sound that would tell me she was home, one thought settled in clearly: she believed she was creating distance between us. But what she was really doing was giving me the space to see everything exactly as it was, and once you see the truth without distortion, you stop reacting to it and start using it. I heard the soft roll of tires over the driveway gravel before I saw the headlights sweep across the living room wall, and just like that, the moment I had been preparing for was no longer theoretical. It was here, real, immediate, and I felt something settle inside me, not nerves, not panic, just the kind of stillness that comes when you already know what matters and what does not. I did not rush to the door, I did not adjust anything or double-check the counter. I simply stayed where I was for one more second, letting the rhythm of the house return to normal, and then I moved, slow, deliberate, like every other evening that had come before this one. The front door opened, the familiar sound of her keys dropping into the ceramic bowl by the entryway, the soft click of her heels against the floor, and then her voice, light, casual, exactly the same as it had always been, calling out my name like nothing in the world had shifted beneath us. I answered from the kitchen, steady, calm, giving her nothing to question, nothing to read between the lines, and when she stepped into view, she looked exactly like she always did after work, composed, put together, just enough fatigue in her expression to make it believable, just enough distance to keep things controlled. She smiled, a small one, polite, practiced, and walked past me to set her bag down, brushing my arm lightly as she moved, a gesture so normal it would have gone unnoticed any other day. But now every detail carried weight, every movement was something to observe, to file away, to understand. I asked how her day was, the same question I had asked 1,000 times before, and she answered just as easily, mentioning meetings, deadlines, the usual pieces of a workday that fit together cleanly, no hesitation, no extra detail, just enough to sound real without inviting further questions, and I nodded, listening, not because I believed it, but because I needed to hear how she said it, the tone, the pacing, the way her eyes held or shifted when she spoke. There was no crack in it, no obvious sign that anything was out of place, and that told me something important. Whatever she was doing, she was comfortable with it, comfortable enough to stand here in front of me and deliver a version of reality that did not include the truth sitting 10 feet away on the counter. I moved toward the refrigerator and asked if she wanted something to drink, keeping my back to her just long enough to break eye contact naturally, to give her space to relax into the moment, because people reveal more when they feel unobserved, and she said yes without thinking, the same way she always did, like this was just another night, just another routine, and I handed her a glass without letting my hand shake, without letting anything slip into my voice that did not belong there. We stood there for a second, side by side, quiet, the kind of silence that would have felt comfortable a week ago, but now it carried something else beneath it, something unsaid, something deliberate. She took a sip and leaned against the counter, glancing briefly in the direction of the papers before looking away just as quickly, and it was subtle, almost nothing, but I saw it, the awareness, the recognition, the split-second calculation of whether anything had changed. And that was the moment I knew she believed everything was still exactly as she left it, that I had not seen anything, had not noticed anything. And that belief was the most valuable thing I had right now. I asked about her plans for the rest of the week, casual, open, giving her room to speak, and she answered with the same careful balance, mentioning work, a possible late evening, something about needing to focus, all of it fitting perfectly into the narrative she had already started building days ago. The one about space, about distance, about separate lives that still sounded reasonable on the surface. I listened, nodded, even smiled once, and all the while I kept my reactions measured, controlled, because this was not the time to challenge anything, this was the time to confirm it, to let her continue exactly as she intended, to watch how the story unfolded when she believed she was the only one writing it. And as I stood there in my own kitchen, looking at the woman I had spent years building a life with, I realized something that made everything clearer than it had been all day. She was not hiding this from me out of fear, she was hiding it because she believed she had already succeeded, because in her mind, the transition was already happening, already set in motion, and I was just a step behind, catching up to something that had already been decided. But the truth was, she had miscalculated one thing. She assumed I would react the way I always had, directly, emotionally, predictably, and because of that she never considered the possibility that I might choose to do something different, something quieter, something that would let me see the entire plan before I made a single move, And that difference, that shift in how I responded, was about to change everything. I did not push, I did not question, I let the conversation move exactly where she wanted it to go, because sometimes the most useful thing you can do is give someone enough space to reveal the version of reality they are trying to maintain. And Olivia was good at it, she had always been good at it, controlled, measured, never saying too much, never leaving obvious gaps. But even the best version of control has edges. And edges show if you know where to look. We moved through the evening like any other night, dinner kept simple, conversation light, nothing that would invite depth or reflection, and I matched her tone perfectly, not cold, not distant, just present enough to keep everything feeling normal, because normal was the mask she needed, and as long as she believed I was still wearing it too, she would not change anything about how she acted. At one point, she mentioned she might need to visit a few places later in the week, something about looking at options, phrased carefully, like it was still undecided, like she was still exploring possibilities, and I nodded, even offered a casual suggestion about neighborhoods without asking for specifics, because I already knew more than she thought I did. And the last thing I needed was for her to feel cornered before I had the full picture. She accepted the suggestion with a small smile, appreciative but distant, and I noticed how easily she stepped into that version of herself, the one that kept things polite but removed, the one that made space feel reasonable instead of intentional. After dinner, she moved to the living room, picking up her phone more often than usual, checking it quickly, responding with short messages, her expression shifting just slightly each time, subtle enough that someone not paying attention would miss it, but I was paying attention now, and patterns that once blended into the background were starting to stand out clearly. There was a rhythm to it, a timing, messages that seemed expected, responses that came too quickly to be casual, and once or twice, I caught a glimpse of the screen before she angled it away, just enough to confirm what I already suspected without giving me anything I could point to directly. I stayed where I was, giving her the illusion of distance she had asked for, sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open, not working, just creating the appearance of it, because appearances were part of this now, for both of us, and if she was constructing a narrative, then I was going to let her believe it was intact. Later, when she stood up and mentioned she had an early morning, her tone softened slightly, almost out of habit, and she paused like she was waiting for something, maybe a question, maybe a reaction, something that would confirm I was still where she expected me to be. But I did not give it to her. I simply nodded, said good night the same way I always had, and watched as she turned and walked upstairs without hesitation. I waited a few seconds after I heard the bedroom door close, then I closed my laptop and sat there in the quiet again, not thinking about what I felt, but about what I had seen, because what I had seen mattered more than anything else. She was consistent, careful, but not cautious, and that difference told me everything. She did not believe there was a risk of being discovered, she believed the plan was already working, that the distance she created was enough to keep me from looking closer, and that confidence was the opening I needed. I stood up slowly and walked toward the stairs, not to confront her, not to check anything, just to confirm one last detail, and as I reached the hallway, I saw the faint glow of light under the bedroom door, steady, not moving, and I stopped there for a second, listening, not for words, but for silence, because silence can tell you more than any conversation. There was no tension, no pacing, no sign of uncertainty, just calm, controlled stillness on the other side, the kind that comes when someone believes everything is going according to plan. I turned away quietly and walked back downstairs, and as I reached the bottom step, one thought settled in with complete clarity. She was not preparing for a possibility anymore, she was preparing for an outcome, and if I wanted to change that outcome, I would need more than suspicion, I would need proof, timing, and something she had not accounted for at all, leverage. I did not go upstairs that night, not right away. I stayed downstairs long enough for the house to settle completely, for every sound to fade into that low, steady quiet that only comes when everything looks normal on the surface. And that was the point. Everything still looked normal. But now I understood that normal was just a layer, something thin enough to hold together as long as no one pressed on it too hard. I moved back into the kitchen, and this time I did not hesitate. I picked up the folder again, more carefully than before, and carried it to the table, sitting down slowly as I opened it, not searching blindly, but reading with intention, line by line, detail by detail, because this was not about catching her anymore, it was about understanding the structure of what she had built. The lease draft confirmed what I had already seen, same address, same timeline, but there were other pieces too, small details that mattered more than they should have, shared utility estimates, a breakdown of monthly costs, and something else that stood out immediately, a joint financial reference, not a shared account, but a coordinated one, something structured in a way that suggested planning, not impulse, and that told me this was not new. This had been discussed, arranged, aligned long before I ever saw that application on the counter. I leaned back slightly and exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but out of clarity, because the more I saw, the less room there was for doubt, and doubt is what keeps people stuck, what makes them hesitate, what makes them act too soon or not at all, and I was not going to do either. I reached for my phone, not to call her, not to message anyone, but to document, to capture what was in front of me without leaving a trace that anything had been touched, a few quiet photos, steady hands, no rush, just enough to make sure I would not have to rely on memory later, because memory can be questioned, but records cannot. When I finished, I placed everything back exactly as it had been, aligning edges, sliding the folder into its original position, leaving the application where it belonged, because the illusion had to stay intact, and then I stood up and turned off the kitchen light, letting the room fall into darkness behind me as I walked into the living room again. I sat down and let the silence settle one more time, but this time it felt different, not heavy, not uncertain, but focused, like everything had narrowed into something I could actually work with. I knew the timeline now, I knew the structure, and more importantly, I knew she believed I was still outside of it, still reacting, still behind, and that belief gave me time, and time is what turns information into leverage. I looked at my phone again, not at the screen, but at the reflection of the room in it, the stillness, the quiet, the space that had been created between us, and for the first time since this started, I allowed myself to think one step ahead instead of just catching up. If she was planning a transition, then there were other parts to it, conversations, legal considerations, financial arrangements, things that do not happen overnight, and if I moved carefully, I could see all of it before she ever realized I was looking. I stood up slowly and headed toward the stairs, not to confront, not to question, but to rest, because tomorrow was not going to be about reacting, it was going to be about positioning, about putting things in place quietly, the same way she had. But with one difference, I was not going to underestimate her awareness, and that meant I would not make the mistake she already had. As I reached the top of the stairs, I paused for just a second, looking down at the darkened house, the place that still looked like a shared life from the outside, and one thought settled in with complete certainty. She believed she was preparing to leave on her terms, but she had no idea that before she ever walked out that door, I would already be somewhere she had not even thought to look. I woke up before the alarm the next morning, not because I was restless, but because my mind had already moved ahead of the day, already mapping out what needed to happen next, and for the first time since all of this began, I did not feel like I was reacting anymore. I felt like I was positioning myself, quietly, deliberately, in a way that would not be obvious until it was too late to undo. The house was still, the kind of early morning silence that makes everything feel suspended, and I moved through it without noise, getting dressed, making coffee, following the same routine I always had, because consistency was part of the plan now. Consistency keeps people comfortable, and comfort keeps them from looking too closely. Olivia came downstairs a little later, dressed for work, composed as always, her expression calm, her tone light, as if the conversation we had days ago was still the only thing shaping the direction of our lives, and I matched it, every word, every gesture, nothing out of place, nothing that would suggest I had seen anything beyond what she had chosen to show me. We spoke briefly, simple things, schedules, timing, the kind of surface-level exchange that fills space without meaning anything, and then she left, the door closing behind her with the same quiet finality it always had, but this time it marked something different, not an absence, but an opening. I waited a full minute after her car pulled away before I moved, not because I needed to, but because patience had become a habit overnight, and I was not going to break it now. When I stepped back into the kitchen, the house felt different, not empty, but available. Like a space that could finally be used without interruption, and I went straight to the counter, not to look again, not to confirm what I already knew, but to begin the part she had not accounted for at all. I gathered the information I had already seen, not physically, but mentally, organizing it into something structured, something usable, dates, names, timelines, and then I did something I had not done yet. I stepped outside of her version of the situation completely. I made a call, not emotional, not rushed, just direct, to someone who understood process, documentation, structure, because this was no longer just about what she was planning, it was about what I needed to secure before her plan reached the point where it could not be adjusted. I did not explain everything, I did not need to. I simply asked the right questions, the kind that reveal options instead of reactions, and by the time the call ended, I had something she did not know existed, a framework, a path forward that did not depend on her decisions at all. I spent the rest of the morning putting small things into place, nothing dramatic, nothing visible, just quiet adjustments that would not be noticed in isolation but would matter when they connected, accounts reviewed, documents organized, access points confirmed, every piece aligned with one goal, control. By midday, the house looked exactly the same, nothing moved, nothing changed, but underneath that surface, everything had shifted, because I was no longer standing inside a situation I did not understand, I was standing outside of it, looking in, and that changes how you move, how you think, how you decide. When Olivia returned that evening, I already knew more than I had the day before, not just about what she was doing, but about what I was going to do. And that difference showed in the smallest ways, in the way I spoke, in the way I listened, in the way I let her continue exactly as she intended without interruption, because now I understood something she did not. Timing is not about acting first. It is about acting when the other person believes you will not act at all. She thought she was preparing to step into a new life, one that did not include me, one that was already set in motion with careful planning and quiet decisions. But what she did not realize was that before that plan reached its final step, I had already taken one of my own, one that would not stop her from leaving, but would ensure that when she did, she would not be the one deciding how the story ended.